This Magnavox amplifier is one of the strangest pieces of equipment that I have come across since starting this channel. It works like a typical stereo amp, but not really. The functions predate the standardization of features and terms that we get with modern component stereo systems, the result of which is an amplifier that exhibits quite a few interesting choices that reflect the transitional era that this thing comes from. And that's what I want to show you guys today. Stick around. So I said that this thing is transitional. What does that mean? I guess the easiest way to explain it is that in the early to mid 60s, we really started to see a shift in home audio from large pieces of furniture into smaller, more modular component systems. The largest companies, or at least the most recognizable, were RCA, Magnavox, and Zenith. They would have been sold through appliance stores like what my great-grandfather used to own in Los Angeles. If memory serves, Great-Grandpa Carl sold Zenith products at his store. He didn't carry a bunch of different products to compare the sound because, frankly, that's not what a lot of people did. They cared about the look, the color, how many trays of deviled eggs it could fit on top, not the crispness and clarity of the sound as much as nowadays. The mindset was closer to furniture shopping and, at most, choosing between a base or premium model. By the way, if any of you grew up with those old consoles, I would love to hear about it. Did you get to use it and did you get to listen to it? Tell me about it in the comments. Gradually, things started to shift to individual components that you would stack on a shelf, which all needed to work together, even if they were mismatched brands. By the late 60s, Japanese brands like Pioneer, Sansui, and Sony had become widely available and were changing the paradigm of home audio from furniture to something very standardized and technical that marketed itself by its tonal quality and power. With more options in a single price range, side-by-side comparisons were becoming the norm, and that required a standardization of terminology and features. This amp was sold right in between those 2 points in time when modular systems were getting popular, but nobody had decided on a universal set of terms, features, or practices. So what we ended up with is an amplifier that looks like a newer component amp, but acts like what you'd find in a console. And that makes some of the choices the designers made on this thing look really odd by modern standards. First and foremost is the power switch. It's connected to the timbre knob, not the volume knob like we see in later systems. It's basically a tone knob. The amp was designed at a time when the sound was adjusted by the feel of it rather than aiming for a flat frequency response. So this was able to shift the sound a little warmer or brighter by tilting a filter across the entire frequency range, depending on your personal taste. Next to it are the bass and treble knobs. These are interesting because they're 4-position rotary switches. They're not hooked to little potentiometers inside. They're meant to act on the extremes of the signal, or in other words, the highest and lowest frequencies of the signal that are audible to us humans. When people talk about the warmness of old equipment, these types of control setups really give you a feel for what they mean by that. It's hard to put into words exactly, but if I had to try, I feel that it almost sounds like you tossed a beach towel over the speakers. Not muffled, but less crisp than modern equipment. We're going to skip the selector switch for a second because it's a whole rabbit hole of strangeness. Don't worry, we will talk about it. In fact, that's why I decided to do this video in the first place. But first, this is the loudness knob. It's not loudness like we think of it today, which is an equalization setting that adjusts the signal to our primitive human ear's frequency response. No, this is what you and I formally know as the volume control. I kind of like that better. Do you want it louder? Turn up the loudness knob. Makes sense. The tuning knob isn't that odd, except that it predates the convention of making it larger than everything else on the interface. The tuner dial is real glass, which means it's still perfectly clear after half a century. You have a little indicator that shows the strength of the radio signal and a red light that shows when you found a stereo FM signal. AM and FM are obvious on the left side, but on the right, you have MC and KC. Those are short for megacycles and kilocycles, which is an archaic way of saying megahertz and kilohertz. The balance knob is spaced slightly farther away from the others for some reason. It works more or less how you would expect. Then you have your 1/4-inch headphone jack and this speaker switch. The headphone jack doesn't automatically disable the speakers, so they included the little switch for private listening. I'm going to show you the function knob, but I think it's important to show you the inputs on the back just for context. You have phono, tape play, and tape record. That's it. Now, if you notice, there are 6 settings. That's 2 more than you would expect. That's because the radio has 4 settings, 3 of which are FM. You have FM AFC, ST FM, and plain vanilla FM. The regular FM is just monaural FM, no stereo. It delivered the most compatibility with older broadcasts. Remember that stereo FM wasn't available everywhere yet. The stereo FM setting engaged the stereo decoder or multiplexer, which would give you actual stereo sound from the radio. And the FM AFC engaged the automatic frequency control, which would actively compensate for drift within the tuning circuit so that the reception stayed centered. The AFC setting runs in stereo as well, which in modern times renders the stereo FM setting redundant. But when this thing was designed, there were concerns that an AFC circuit might pull the tuner just off center enough that it would confuse the stereo decoder and make it keep turning on and off. I don't know if that was the case at the time, but using this now, it doesn't seem to struggle with that at all. It stayed perfectly aligned for all 2 hours of Full Metal Jackie on 93.4 FM. Obviously, you have AM and tape, and we all know what that does. Except, it's worth noting that if you want to use this with a modern line-level component or a phone, you do have to just hook it up to the tape play input and use that instead of a tape deck. If you wanted more than one component, you'd need a separate switch box like this, which you can buy on Amazon for cheap, but that's an extra step. Now phono. Watch this. This thing is now off. The whole machine is powered off. Why does it do that? Well, that's because it's missing a piece. Actually, 2 pieces. This is one of them. It's a 3-prong power cord that plugs into the port on the back of the amp and connects it to the other missing piece, which is a record player. What Magnavox did here was route power through a little switch that shunted it off to a separate turntable, which would then route it back to the amplifier, only then energizing the transformer and powering the amp. But why though? So if we think back to when this thing was made, the hardware inside and all of its accessories were designed to fit into a large console. This one is in a standalone box, but that's not typical of this piece of hardware. What they intended to do was make all of the parts of your console controlled through one interface. Flipping to phono would make the record player come on and prevent its use when the amp wasn't getting a signal from it. That philosophy was still in play when they made this. And I know that because the speakers and record player were sitting there with it. Unfortunately, the turntable was completely thrashed and the speakers weren't for sale for whatever reason. Because the machine turns off when you flip to phono, it's obviously pretty difficult to test it with a normal turntable. However, there is a way to do it, and I'll show you that once we open this thing up. But before I do that, I'd like to show you the back again because the speaker hookups are also a little odd by modern standards. Every amp you find nowadays, and almost anything you find from the late 60s onward, will have a minimum of 4 speaker terminals in the back, or a pair of RCA plugs occasionally, but even those are 4 separate terminals. This amp, however, only has 3. The right and left terminals are labeled 1 and 2, and the center one is a common ground. While this seems strange, if you look closely at newer amps, they often share common ground too. It's just hidden, like in the case of this Pioneer. You can see they're both connected to the same ground eventually. The speakers hook to the amp pretty easily. You can use bare wires, but in a configuration like this, having spade connectors will eliminate headaches, so I would encourage it since you have to stack the ground wires. These little banana plug adapters are really convenient. I found them on Amazon, and you can get all kinds of different ones to make it easier to hook differently terminal things together for testing. So let's open this thing up. First things first, I'm taking the back panel off. The little wood screws that they used are not very long and tend to wallow out the holes bit by bit every time I remove them, so I don't love opening this thing. It's easily fixable with wood glue and a bamboo skewer, which I'll show you how to do afterward, but it's still an extra step you can avoid by not repeatedly opening up these types of things. They also have a screw on the bottom that has to come out before the panel will release. With the panel removed, we can see the internal hardware. There's more evidence that this was designed to be in a console, not a standalone box. This little plug would have powered a tape machine, but it's totally inaccessible under the back panel. It's switched, meaning it's controlled by the power switch in the front. Again, that tracks with this amp being meant for a console, since they'd want the power switch to turn the tape machine on and off at the same time. To get the chassis out, we have to take the screws out of the bottom as well. There are 5. Once you get each screw out, the whole assembly will slide out through the front, but I highly recommend disconnecting the speaker wires so that the back panel can slip through more easily. I marked the terminals with Sharpies to indicate which wire goes where. When I got this, the radio dial did not light up. Both of the light bulbs were burned out. Now, that's an easy fix though. It uses a pair of 6.3 volt bayonet style number 47 bulbs. You can get LED or incandescent replacements. I like to keep things original, so I went with incandescents, but I had to buy them on Amazon. I was able to get 12 volt bulbs that fit at the hardware store, and you could use those if you want, but they are a little bit dimmer. Though, to be fair, you might want that. I don't know. They just key into these little holders with cool little light shields on them. Now, regarding the phono test. This is where it's a little more advanced than I usually like to go on this channel. This requires a multimeter, some alligator clips, a dummy load, and a dim bulb tester, which are things that I realize novices probably don't have. And that's okay. I want to state that this is not the officially correct way to test this function. It's just the quick and dirty way that I used to see whether the phono function works at all. I would encourage you to be very cautious in these situations because you can easily wreck stuff if you accidentally shunt power to the wrong place, which will leave you with a lot more work than you signed on for initially. Back here, on the back of the function knob, is a little power switch. This is what turns off the machine and routes power out through the record changer cable. It's literally a little on-off switch that turns the machine off when I switch to phono. Just to show you with the multimeter, on every other setting, I can see that there's continuity between this terminal and this terminal, and it breaks when I switch to phono. The idea is that we want to make the switch stay on when we turn it to phono. Does that make sense? The easiest way to make the machine stay on is to bypass the switch entirely so that it can't turn the machine off anymore. I'll do that by hooking an alligator clip from this terminal to this terminal. Remember, those are the ones that have continuity when the selector is on any other setting than phono. That's all I did. I could solder a permanent wire on, but I don't want to actually modify this thing just in case I encounter a record changer that requires this type of power setup eventually. Now, before I actually turn it on, I want to hook it back into the dim bulb tester. This, if you're not familiar, is a device that limits the current going into the machine so that if there's some kind of short or some kind of problem, the light bulb takes the brunt of it instead of whatever you have plugged in. Whatever wattage of bulb you put in will be the maximum amount of current it'll supply rather than the full power coming in from the wall. It's a safety device for your electronics. With the switch bypassed and the amp plugged into the dummy load and dim bulb tester, I used a 15 watt bulb here because I don't want to run a bunch of current through my little clip wire. I can pull out the RIAA filter from the field testing video, hook it to my phone, and give it a really quick test with the headphones. It works. Everything's dim because of the 15 watt bulb, but we know that it turns on and functions the way that it's supposed to. That's all I'm concerned about. Now I can disconnect everything. Before I put everything away, I do want to point out that these are the original capacitors in here. They are very old. I am not going to change them. I've found many reasonable arguments online for changing them, and a few equally reasonable arguments for not doing so. As it sits, it works and sounds nice enough to my ear, so I'd rather not touch anything that I don't have to. However, these do degrade over time, and that does affect the sound. So if you do want to change them, I say go for it. Just make sure that you use decent quality caps and pay attention to the polarity when you install them. It's really not that hard to do if you're careful. Before I reassemble, let's fix the holes in the back of the case so the screws actually work. All I did there was drill the hole out a little, then take a piece of bamboo skewer and glue it in the hole with some PVA glue. After about an hour, it was dry and I just clipped the end off and ran the screws into what was essentially fresh wood. That held it nice and firm so we don't have to worry about everything stripping out. But there we go, all back together and ready to play. This was a fun video I didn't expect to make. This amp just kind of fell in my lap, and it was very strange to me. So I kind of had to do a video on it as soon as I saw it. I'll be doing the little Sony speakers next because they turned out to be a bit of a cautionary tale about assuming speakers are always easily repairable. So I'll see you guys soon. Stay metal and keep thrifting.